Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yes? Good. This is happening because some students said the speaker we would most like for Green Week, which we've now missed, would be George Monbiot. And I don't suppose anybody knows George. And I said, well, funnily enough, we've worked together for a long time, and I think he would probably take my call. And he couldn't come in Green Week because he was too busy, but here he is the week after Green Week. And this event has been slightly missold because I thought actually it would be more interesting not to have a conversation, but just for George to begin the conversation with a few things that are on his mind. And then I know he would like to respond to observations and questions from you. For those of you who are less familiar with George, he's a very interesting and almost unique figure, I think, in British journalism. I think he's a great example of why it is important to have fringe voices, people who say apparently extraordinary and radical things, because quite often they end up as the mainstream. And I think lots of things that George has written about and advocated and championed in the past, for which he has been roundly attacked and ridiculed and mercilessly lampooned, you watch and you think over 5 years, over 10 years, over 20 years, people no longer laugh at these ideas. They've become quite mainstream. And I've watched how George has done it. He's an amazing generalist, so he ranges across a big range of subjects. I think probably because he's been forced to defend his work so often, he has a tendency to publish all his evidence, not always in The Guardian, somewhere elsewhere. And I know, as his editor for a long time, that actually his evidence is incredibly robust. And it had to be, because George was sometimes taking on very powerful institutions and companies and ways of thinking. And so he needed to be able to defend it, and almost always. A
few mistakes along the way.
But we never had a stunting libel action or anything, did we? No. And so actually, if the evidence was there. Yeah. And the other, I think George is unique in this respect. If you go to his website, he publishes his own register of interests. And he tells you exactly how much he gets paid. He tells you exactly how much tax he pays. He tells you the rental income he takes from his property. He tells you how much he pays his researchers. And everything is laid out down to the last 50p. Because he thinks that transparency in journalism is important. And I think lots of journalists think transparency is important, but I don't know anyone who takes it to the extent that George does. So he's a very interesting figure, I think, exactly the right person to be coming to LMH in not quite Green Week. And George, you talk for as long as you want, or as short as you want, and then we can open it up.
Thanks very much, Alan. Well, Alan asked me to say what was on my mind, so it's going to be pretty confused. Because, it's always pretty confused, but particularly so at the moment, because it's one of those great moments of flux for me and for hopefully many other people as well. It ought to be a great moment of flux. In fact, everything ought to be a great moment of flux at all times, but particularly now. Our thinking has been challenged, especially those of us in the second or third bloom of youth, challenged by much younger people, as it should be. And that forces reassessment. It ought to force reassessment. Unfortunately, across most of the media, it does not, and people become stuck in the groove, as we see again and again, and forces a whole rethink of our relationship to each other and to the rest of the living planet, or, as I say, so it should. So what I'm thinking about at the moment is intergenerational theft, an issue at the heart of both our environmental and economic crises, an issue brought to the fore by the brilliant youth climate strikers who were so much in evidence here in Oxford a couple of weeks ago and will be again in 8 days' time, hopefully in even greater numbers than before, who are challenging us on this crucial issue to which we have to respond. Now, in seeking to respond to it, I find myself, as always, way outside my comfort zone. I studied zoology at university, and it turned me into an idiot, or perhaps more of an idiot, because I learned an awful lot about zoology in those 3 years. And by the end of it, I felt I knew less about the rest of the world than I did when I began. I lament the extreme specialization of most of the degrees on offer today. It's crazy. We have young people on the threshold of life, the whole world at their feet, the whole world to discover. And we channel them into these amazingly narrow degrees where you learn about one subject and one subject alone. And often learn all sorts of fascinating things about that subject, but you can't contextualize it. And the times call on us all to be interdisciplinary now. We cannot grasp any aspect of what's going on Earth without understanding something of the context in which it's occurring. The more we understand, the more we see that everything is connected. As John Muir said, if you try to unhook one aspect of the world, you find that it is connected by threads to every other. And as in this globalized economy, in this globalized polity, faced with huge global environmental, economic, political, social issues, we cannot afford to remain locked within narrow disciplines if we're trying to think about the world. So I'm going to range into subjects I know absolutely nothing about tonight, including philosophy and economics, briefly, because actually I think this subject, above all others, demands overwhelmingly the input of younger people. So I'm going to try not to talk for too long in order to allow younger people and the rest of those of us who are less young people to have your say on this crucial and fascinating subject. So, intergenerational theft. Well, I would define this as the capture by current generations of natural wealth and opportunities for well-being from people who have either not yet been born or are not yet old enough to make their interests felt. And much of this, the degree to which we arrogate to ourselves the right to this capture arises from what I see as a huge, almost unexamined assumption at the heart of capitalism and indeed at the heart of most current political and economic thinking. And the assumption goes as follows: that a person is entitled to as much natural wealth as they can buy. That if you have enough money in your bank account, you can use that money to buy a big tract of land, or some minerals, or part of the atmosphere, through flying your private jet around, or you're driving your Ferrari. Or you can buy as much rare fish to eat, or as much beef to eat as you want with that money. That somehow those numbers in your bank account translate into a right to a chunk of the earth, and to as much of the earth as those numbers allow you to buy. What possible just principle turns those arbitrary numbers into a right to more than your equal share of the world's natural wealth? I mean, this surely is the great and most obvious question of our times. So obviously everybody's asking it, aren't they? I haven't seen a single discussion on this subject anywhere in the media, anywhere in public discussion. It's just not there. It might be there, and forgive my ignorance if it is, in some of the fascinating academic discussions that you're having within the university, but I'm not seeing it in broader public discourse, and yet it should surely be at the heart of everything that we're discussing. It's one of those many dogs that isn't barking. Why aren't we hearing it? Now, if you push people on this, and if they have some long-standing issue in the surrounding subjects, what they might do as a first and last resort is to turn to some version of the labour theory of property, some version of the ideas formulated by John Locke in his second treatise on government, which broadly says you acquire rights to own natural wealth. In this case, he was talking about the land, but he made it clear that it applied to other forms of natural wealth as well. You acquire rights to own natural wealth through mixing your labour with it. You mix your labour with the land, and therefore you have a right to that land. Now, straight away, even before you examine the ways in which Locke's ideas have been used, you begin to scratch your head over this formulation. And incidentally, that notion was picked up by William Blackstone and pretty well became the basis of English property law, which then became the basis of property law in many other parts of the world. It was picked up by Robert Nozick and became the basis of a whole load of other presumptions. And yet it is so flimsy, so shaky, so utterly preposterous that one wonders how it passed anyone's scrutiny at all. So let's start with Locke's initial assumption, which he formulated, as he had a good way with words, with the phrase, all the world was once America. And what he meant by that was that all the world was once a blank slate, a terra nullis with no ownership and no rights over natural wealth. Now, he was right, but not for the reasons that he thought, because in fact, all the world pretty well had the same experience of colonization as America had. His formulation was rather convenient for a former secretary to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, which is what John Locke was, because what was happening at the time was genocide. Other people had been mixing their labour with that land for thousands of years, roughly 14,000 years, when the Lords Proprietors and the rest turned up. But in order to establish their just principle on which they could grab the land, they first of all had to eliminate the people who were already on the land, which they did by various means, by expulsion, by chicanery, or simply by murder. Mass murder turned out to be a highly effective way of acquiring a just principle on which you can build your basis for land ownership. And it was at that point then where you say, right, now on this terra nullis, this blank slate, I can mix my labour with the land and thereby acquire rights to it. So that happens at one moment, at an arbitrary moment. There is a point at which you can disregard all previous rights, all previous mixing of labour with the land, if that was any kind of a just right of ownership, and by mixing your labour with that land at that very point, you are the one, and the one alone, who acquires the right to that land. But weirdly, it doesn't stop there, because having once acquired that right, you can then hold that right in perpetuity. You can pass that right on to your idiot children who might never have to do a stick of work in their lives because they can live off the rents of that land, which you once acquired by once mixing your labour with it. So in other words, not only is this locked in time backwards, it's locked in time forwards as well. There's that one arbitrary moment in history where you, the lucky person, can, for a year, a month, a week, a minute, mix your labour with the land, in doing so saying, this land is now mine and will be forevermore. This is patently preposterous. But it doesn't stop there, because even in Locke's formulation, your labour doesn't actually have to be your labour. In fact, in the situation he was talking about, it's precisely not your labour. What you have to do, or what you need to do, is to mix the labour of your servants or slaves with the land, and in so doing, you have a just right to acquire that land. You don't have to turn a single sod. You don't have to touch a spade. The people who are least likely to apply any labour of their own to the land are the ones who acquire the land. And what you quickly discover is that that just principle, which is the basis for land ownership, is actually based not on mixing your labour with the land, but on owning slaves. So the just principle by which people can own natural wealth is slave ownership. Doesn't sound very just to me. But then even if somehow we could magically dismiss all those objections, you're still left with the disconcerting question, why? Why does mixing your labour with the land give you a right of ownership of that land? What's the obvious connection between labour and land, between working on it and owning on it? I can see how you might have a right to own the crops because those came about entirely as a result of your labour. Or you might have the right to own a house which you build on the land because that comes about as a result of your labour. But the land itself, you didn't create it by working on it. It was there. It was there for millions of years before you were there. How come you get to own it? Own this piece of the fabric of this planet which has been kicking around for billions of years by working on it? There's no obvious connection I can see at all. It's like the constable in Flann O'Brien's novel, The Third Policeman, who goes around puncturing people's bicycle tyres because he believes that if you ride your bicycle too much, you become part bicycle and the bicycle becomes part human. You've mixed your body with the bicycle. It really is as absurd as that. But this absurdity is the basis of our sense that we have a right to ownership of natural wealth. Now, there was an important rider. Locke said, this would be just as long as there is enough and as good land for other people in common which the rest of people can share. It's fine for people to acquire as much as they want as long as everybody else has enough. Now, even at the time, it was highly debatable that there was enough for everybody else, while the lords proprietors or the tenants or settlers, whoever, who took over from them, then basically extended their land holdings as fast and as extensively as they possibly could. But today, it's evident that in no aspect of natural wealth is there enough and as good outside the domain of private property ownership as there is within it. We patently do not have enough. Billions of people on Earth do not have enough of basic commodities, let alone of an actual proprietorial share of natural wealth. It's just not there. It doesn't exist. There's not enough atmosphere for everybody at current rates of proprietorial use. The pollution that is being pumped into it. There's not enough fish. There's not enough soil. There's not enough building land, real estate. All of these commodities are scarce, which is why they are valuable commodities. So we see straight away, even with Locke's proviso at the very original formulation, this just principle cannot apply, even if all the other absurdities somehow and magically did apply. So I think we have to rethink the entire system by 6:30. Well, perhaps we don't have to rethink the entire system, because in that formulation of Locke's, enough and as good in common, I think we see part, at least, of the way forward. Is that in common bit, I think, is crucially important. When we position ourselves politically, we tend to do so along a single axis, which has state at one end and market at the other. And if you're on the left, you say, I want more state and less market. And if you're on the right, you say, I want more market and less state. And that's how we talk about things. And we have, as a result, I believe, utterly dismal political discussions. And part of the reason for that is that we completely ignore the two other equally important pillars of the economy. Number 3, the household. Crucial. Some people call it the core economy. In this wonderful book, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner?, Catherine Marcel points out that the household is constantly neglected, and therefore the role of women, who still play the dominant role within the household, is completely neglected by economists. She points out that while Adam Smith was writing his Wealth of Nations, his long-suffering mother, Margaret Douglas, was doing all the housework around him, enabling him to write the Wealth of Nations. But her hands remained invisible. He didn't mention her role or the role of women's labour in the household at all in any of his economic treatises. Extraordinary. There's a total neglect by economists, almost all of whom for a very long time were men, of this huge third sector of the economy without which you have no other economy at all. And then there's the fourth sector of the human economy, the commons. And so neglected is this in economic discourse that every time you mention it, you have to explain it. How many people here could comfortably define the commons? That's fine, that's about average. Oh, actually more than average. Yes, a couple of halves there. Thank you. It's amazing. You know, this was once the dominant economic sector and is now so marginalized in thought and in practice that even to talk about it feels like trespassing. The commons is neither market nor state. It's not capitalism, it's not communism. It exists in a sphere of its own. It can be defined as follows. It consists of 3 principal elements: a resource, which could be a piece of land or a forest or a river or some software or a platform, an internet platform, whatever it might be, an app. A resource which is controlled by a particular community, which then creates rules and negotiations for managing that resource. Resource, community, rules and negotiations. There's 3 primary elements that define a commons, but there's a couple more bits of the definition. The resource is inalienable. It can't be sold and it can't be given away. It is acquired by any new member of that community who joins it, either through immigration into the community or through birth. It is lost by any member of the community who leaves the community, either through emigration or through death. And either the resource itself or the product of the resource is shared equally among the members of the community. Classic example is allotments. Anyone here got an allotment? Quite a few, thanks. Yeah. And you are all commoners. You're all members of a commons. What you have is a resource, which is a piece of land. You have the rules and negotiations set up by the allotment association, where you, the community, the community which is the allotment association, you set the rules and negotiations. The resource is inalienable, in principle at any rate. It can't be sold or given away. And you have an equal right to the resource itself, not to the product of the resource, because there, in justifiably mixing your labour with the land, you can take whatever crops you create that wouldn't otherwise exist back home. You don't have to share them with other people, but you get an equal plot of that land to all the other members of that community. It's a classic commons. Now, I believe that we can start to extend that principle massively into more and more sectors. We should start to think about ways in which we can start transferring natural wealth out of private hands and into common hands. We should start to look at ways in which we could legally establish the atmosphere, the oceans, the ecosystems that surround them into commons, but commons perhaps which legally entitle not just humans, but the other species with which we share them to perpetuity and inalienability. Well, as I say, this is just the beginning of a discussion, and I hope that you're going to help me to think it through a little more, because, as you've probably noticed, there's quite a lot more thinking to be done. But it seems to me that this is the scale of thinking that we need to be doing, that we have to dig up not just that unexamined assumption that I've been talking about today, but a whole series of unexamined economic and political assumptions, which, because they are unexamined, because they are invisible, allow people quietly to pocket the natural wealth and the future well-being of others, of children, of people who don't yet exist. Indeed, to write those people off through discount rates. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? That we can use economic discounting to say, in effect, we are entitled to this stuff whose capture will deprive other people of its use. What we're effectively doing is putting discount rates on human life. And then those human beings are born, and they reach their teenage years, or they reach maturity, and they say, hang on a minute, I've got the same rights as you. And you say, yeah, you are actually a human being. Damn. How does that figure? You just realize that that whole economic theory has just gone out the window because actually you can't apply discount rates to human life. But because of all these unexamined assumptions, we effectively put their future into our pockets. And if we're going to live in a just world, if we're going to live in a world which is both spatially and temporally just, then those are the assumptions that we have to examine. Thank you.
Well, I know that in this audience we have lawyers and political scientists and zoologists and philosophers and moral thinkers. So this is a perfect audience to pick up that. Somebody.
Do you mind if we go woman, man, and if anybody identifies as non-binary, can raise their hand at any time? Oh, all right, well, we'll start with you, then we go to a woman.
Okay. You happen to be a man, I think.
Hi, George. I like the talk. I agree with a lot of what you said. I'm none of those professions. I'm just a master's student here doing conservation. And we've had a big focus on environmental economics in our course. I've found that I've been quite against a lot of it. My question for you is, could you see a world in which the forces that I would say have brought us to the situation we're in can be used to solve their own problems, as in consumerism, which I would link to capitalism?
Thank you. Well, I think this is another crucial question. And as has certainly been attributed to Einstein, probably misattributed, most of these quotes are, you cannot solve a problem with the thinking that got you into it. And constantly we're trying to solve this problem with the thinking that got us into it. Green consumerism, green growth. Green growth is as much as an oxymoron as clean coal. It's preposterous. It's another of our preposterous assumptions. So Jason Hickel's done some very interesting work on this. And broadly speaking, 15 billion tons of material flow a year is roughly a level that the world systems can sustain without breaching planetary boundaries. At the moment, is roughly 70 billion tons is what we're using. So as a result, we're breaching several of the critical planetary boundaries, putting Earth systems under massive strain. Now, most of the world's governments and global bodies want growth to continue. In fact, they all do. And they talk about growth rates. They talk airily of 3% growth. That's a reasonable rate of growth. Well, that means a doubling in economic activity every 24 years. And you say, right, so we're already breaching the planetary boundaries as a result of our economic activity. And now you want to double that activity. How's that going to work? Oh, and by the way, then it doubles again and after another 24 years. So we have 4 times as much in 48 years. Now already, material resource use has increased 3-fold in 40 years. So we're going to have that 12-fold increase in the next 40 years? It's extraordinary. Just an amazing thing. They say, oh no, don't worry, we can decouple. We can decouple economic growth from material resource use. No trouble at all. So Jason ran the numbers and just looked at various things such as limits to efficiency. The Carnot limit, for instance, Carnot efficiency. I mean, there's all sorts of inherent thermodynamic limits to efficiency, which economists don't do thermodynamics, and much rather assume that it doesn't exist. And in fact, in most of their assumptions, it doesn't exist. It's fine. Okay, we can just dispense with the physical world. And he looked at the limits to absolute decoupling, which has never happened anywhere on Earth, and the limits to relative decoupling, which means less resource use per unit of economic activity rather than less resource use altogether. And he found that current rates of growth without intervention, by 2050 we get to around 180 billion tons of resource use. Remembering the sustainable level is roughly 50 billion, we're currently at 70 billion. With some incredibly optimistic assumptions, a very high carbon price, and completely ignoring the Jevons paradox, the rebound effect, you could possibly, at current rates of growth, limit that to 90 billion tons a year. That's still almost double the sustainable level. But then you have to take into account the rebound effect, which says that the more efficient use of any particular resource leads to an increased use of that resource, because it becomes cheaper to use that resource than it does competing resources, and so money flows into the use of that resource. And if you take into account the rebound effect, you get up to about 130 billion tons, which is almost twice our current use of resources. So you just can't do it. So all this stuff about green consumerism and green growth is, to use the term understood by both scientists and economists, bollocks.
Right, under the Monbiot rules, we need a female, somebody, yeah, here we are. Right.
Yes, so thank you very much for your talk. So you set out the issue as a unified, in a sense, problem that, in a sense, also requires a uniform solution. And I think we need to be careful in that regard, because the allotment issue, that is one that works, because you would share your allotment with people from the same neighborhood or from the same area of town. You would possibly know each other. There's also the social pressure and the kind of uncodified kind of behavioral codex that also works and kind of nudges behavior in a specific way. And that doesn't necessarily work at a global scale. So I think when we're kind of reflecting on the possible solutions and ways ahead, that we also need to consider both legal culture, that something works in certain countries or contexts, but not in others, and just the plurality of regulatory kind of responses. And that they don't need to be of regulatory nature, but the different responses that are required here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm absolutely not saying this is the one and only solution. I think that the commons is part of the solution. It's massively neglected. It's got an awful lot to teach us, both practically and sort of theoretically and metaphorically. It's been massively maligned and misunderstood. The classic formulation is the tragedy of the commons. Garrett Hardin's famous paper in 1968, published in Science, by a game theorist, a biologist, who clearly had never come across a commons in reality and didn't even understand the theoretical basis of a commons. What he was describing was an open access regime, a bit like the oceans are today, oceanic fisheries. Beyond national territorial limits, anyone can have a go and just grab as many fish as they want, with catastrophic results. He was assuming that applies in a commons, which is involves, as I say, a resource controlled by a particular community. Now, he used the example of a herder who's putting an animal onto a common pasture, and the herder receives 100% of the value of that animal, but the cost imposed by that extra animal is shared by the community as a whole. Now, it just happened that I read The Tragedy of the Commons when I was working in northwestern Kenya with the Turkana people, who were herders, pastoralists, on common land. If someone grazed their animals without permission on your clan's land, or added more animals to their flock than they were entitled to do, they would be driven away with sticks. They did it twice, they'd be tied to a tree and beaten with sticks. They did it 3 times, they'd be tied to a tree and beaten to death with sticks. Harsh, but no one could deny that regulation was occurring. Now, this utterly preposterous notion became another preposterous, so basically what I discover as I go on through life is that just about everything we believe to be true, everything that is common knowledge within the media, within public discourse, within popular understanding is complete rubbish. And the tragedy of the commons is another one of those. This was adopted massively, picked up because lots of people wanted to privatize or nationalize commons. So both governments and neoliberals wanted commons for themselves. It was a massive resource grab, and the tragedy of the commons gave them that opportunity. So it's a hugely misunderstood sector. It's a hugely underexplored sector, despite the wonderful work by Elinor Ostrom and others. And it's got tremendous potential for further exploration and examination because while I accept what you say about different legal norms and things around the world, one thing is quite remarkable, that commons have been independently generated around the world in almost identical forms. It's quite remarkable. I mean, in the Americas, in Siberia, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, we see commons following very similar trajectories because there is a sort of social and economic logic to them. This is how we rub along. This is how we are able to manage natural wealth without killing each other. We do so by creating a commons. So I think there is a sort of common touchstone here that we can draw on and apply. But exactly how we do that, especially when we're looking at huge global resources, well, there's a lot of work still to be done. And obviously, you can't just do it through spontaneous negotiation. There has to be legal frameworks and all the rest of it. But I believe it gives us some broad guidelines to which we can begin to work.
David.
George, I wonder if I could dare to nudge you just a little bit further down your radical road.
Please.
That you were talking about two very closely related, entwined things, and one of them was about the way people have acquired and then retained territory, but another, perhaps even more perplexing, was about the amount of available territory and how it can reasonably be partitioned. So on that second part, the nudge I would like to make to you is that if there is a cake and there's only so many slices of it available, and at the moment it's not sliced in a sustainable or even rational way, that's a big problem because there's so many people to be considered. How do you react to the thought that the family of concern spreads beyond people to biodiversity and the wider environment, meaning that the slicing of that cake is even more challenging? And I think it's a question about what I think an ethicist would call intrinsic value. People have it. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. People who have it require our concern. My position is that there are other animals that have intrinsic value and also need to be concerned, a cause of concern when we do that slicing up. So I think the problem is even bigger and requires an even more radical solution than you were conservatively hinting at.
Yes, well, yes, I'm often accused of conservatism. Thank you, David. No, well, look, I completely agree, except I would say not just animals, obviously, all life forms. And we have intergenerational theft and interspecific theft as well. And we arrogate to ourselves these huge proportion of the living world, whereas we, instead of sharing it with the many millions of other species that live here. Now, I very much support the aims of the Nature Needs Half campaign. It's not very generous, considering we're one species and they're millions. Well, we'll let them have half, but at least it's a start. Of course, we're a very long way from that. If you look at British marine reserves, I mean, the actual proper marine, not the paper parks, which just are lines on a map, but the actual places where fishing is not allowed, where we have 48,000 square kilometres of territorial waters in this country. 5 of them are set aside for nature, 5 square kilometres. So that's nature gets 0.001%, if I got that right. Or, anyway, give or take a 0. Yeah, not very much. And it's we are shockingly ungenerous towards the rest of the living world. And you're absolutely right. We have to I mean, even for instrumental reasons, we should be giving nature at least half. Not least because we now discover, fascinatingly, and I've been doing a bit of work on this, and it's a really quite exciting field, that really the only way we're going to avoid climate breakdown is through allowing ecosystems to recover and drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. We've now left it so late that even if we cut all industrial emissions, transport emissions, domestic emissions tomorrow, we're almost certainly going to breach 1.5 degrees of global heating. That seems to be pretty well the scientific consensus now. So we need carbon drawdown alongside that. And there are all sorts of crazy exotic schemes like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which, in one scenario means planting up an area 3 times the size of India with plantations, burning the wood in power stations and burying the carbon dioxide in geological formations, which leads either to mass starvation or to mass environmental destruction or both. It's insane. But there are plenty of highly intelligent academics who think it's a great idea. Or the direct air capture with massive machines, which it probably requires so much carbon-heavy infrastructure that it pushes us past the tipping point into disaster anyway. But there is this much better way of doing it, which is allow ecosystems to recover and they draw down carbon. So forests are basically wet carbon. They draw it out of the air, they turn it into wood. Peat is a fantastic accumulator of carbon, salt marshes, mangroves. If we stop trawling and dredging, they are constantly mobilizing the carbon in the seabed, kicking it up into the water column where it oxidizes into carbon dioxide. You leave it be, you've got a huge carbon store. So there's self-interest here as well as the interests of other species. So you're absolutely right. It complicates it further. We have to take into account our theft of natural wealth from all the other species on Earth as well. But perhaps there's not so much conflict between those aims as we might initially assume.
For Charlie. Hi.
Thank you so much for this talk. So just building on what you talked about supporting nature needs half and transferring wealth from private hands to commons. How do you see that in light of debates about viewing ourselves as a separation from nature versus what are ideas of wilderness and what ideas of nature we're trying to restore the earth to, and how you sort of add to popular narratives about what ideas we're trying to restore to and connect people to nature with. How do you see that?
Thanks. Well, another crucial issue. And this issue immediately asks us to consider baselines. There's this wonderful concept formulated by the fisheries scientist Daniel Pauly called shifting baseline syndrome. And that says that we conceive as natural and normal the situation that prevailed in our youth. And so we look at ecosystems as they were in our youth and say that's how they ought to be. We need to get back to that, and then everything will be fine. Forgetting that what we were used to was a state of extreme depletion that our parents or grandparents would have seen as an appalling situation. And they would have thought the right situation is what prevailed in my youth. And so it goes on. And so we forget. It's this societal forgetting. And we forget, for instance, that in Britain, ours is an elephant-adapted ecosystem. You walk outside, you see the deciduous trees here. Why do they coppice? Why do they hedge? Why are the small understory trees much stronger than the big overstory trees? It's because they evolved to resist the straight-tusked elephant, Elephas anticus, or Paleoopsilon anticus, as I think it is now, this vast creature which made the African elephant look like a ballet dancer. There should be elephants here. But so far there hasn't been much clamour for their reintroduction. I don't know why, but and there should be lions, and there should be hippos, and there should be rhinos. I mean, I'm saying should. There were before we came and trashed them all. So it's going to be a constant negotiation. What baseline do we go to? Incidentally, Daniel Pauly has also come up with this concept, shifting waistline syndrome. He points out that a medium-sized jumper today is about 3 sizes bigger than it was 40 years ago. But it's medium, it's fine. We forget that what's medium today is large before. It applies in politics as well. You become used to all sorts of outrageous situations, and that's a real massive human failing. So there's this constant negotiation about, what is a healthy relationship between human beings and the rest of the living world. And I think the starting point is that rest of the living world. It's that recognition that we are one of many species. We don't have inherent and intrinsic rights that are greater than those of other species. But somehow, because we are so much better at projecting our rights than other species are, we have to interpret our position and balance our demands against the needs of other species to exist. And there's no easy answer. There are no clear dividing lines at all. As an ecologist, I'd say as much as we can possibly get away with. And that's the sort of rewilding principle which I've applied is, the constraints on rewilding are not ecological. You could have wolves perfectly happily living out of dustbins in Oxford. Or maybe not with the new collection system, but in principle, there's plenty of deer in Oxford, and wolves would be perfectly happy here. But the constraints tend to be political. For some reason, people would object to wolves living off the deer and the cats and the dogs of Oxford. And so it's basically as much as you can get away with politically, and so that then depends upon persuasion and debate and discourse and all the other things which are largely forbidden by the UK's media.
I think we have to have a woman at the top, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, we just had a man. What was that last one? Whose turn is it?
There is a man. It is a man's turn.
It's a man, sorry. It's a
We can have
man's
a man.
turn, sorry.
We are allowed a man. We're allowed a man.
Lost count.
And incidentally, anyone, if you identify as non-binary, you stick your hand up at any time.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So, in light of the important questions you've raised about the global economy, property, growth, how do we approach this and also consider individuals in low-income countries who perfectly justifiably would like to live the lifestyles we've enjoyed in richer countries?
The only option is for us to reduce our levels of consumption to fit within planetary boundaries. We can't say to anybody else, you can't have what we've had unless we are showing that we're actually prepared not to have that anymore. Now, this is a huge challenge, obviously, but we're only going to navigate it and negotiate it by, I think, radically changing our economic system. If we have a system which continues to be based on capital accumulation and competition and self-aggrandizement through capital, and fundamentally the belief that the numbers in your bank account equate to a right to grab natural wealth, then obviously everybody is going to be scrambling over everybody else to get as much of their share as they possibly can. The only way we can possibly resolve this is by having a system based on different principles, and that's why I'm so interested in the commons, because that enables everybody to have wealth, everybody to have their needs met without depriving other people of wealth. Because in a resource-constrained world, which is what we're in, at the moment, any extra increment of natural wealth that accrues to yourself is taken from somebody else. And we have to move to a system where that's no longer the case. Now, as with all these discussions, the more you talk, the more ambitious it becomes, because you begin to recognize the implications of you begin to see just how huge the thing is that you're asking for. But we've got to think big. We're faced with huge existential crises at the moment. We're faced with an emergency, a climate emergency, an ecological emergency, an emergency of equity and distribution, an economic emergency, a political emergency. Because those other emergencies aren't being dealt with, we have these great openings for demagogues and fascists to move into the political space because politics isn't delivering for people. And these are huge issues which require huge responses. And we can't do it anymore just by tinkering, but we have an entire political system dedicated to tinkering, to technocratic managerialism, which just says, maybe we tweak this a little bit, things will be all right. They won't be. They're not going to be all right. Tweaking isn't going to make anything all right anymore. We need huge revolutionary change. And that begins with thinking and talking, deciding. I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm beginning to see just how big the answers have to be.
Question up here.
So on that point, I wonder if the commons is a red herring and actually it's just tinkering. Because really, it seems to me that what you're highlighting is the virtue of the commons is it makes clear what is the carrying capacity of the earth. But it's only going to work if the people in that community know what the carrying capacity is. So I wonder if really what you're talking about are the laws which protect that carrying capacity. So for example, if you just move to saying, okay, let's have a law about intergenerational theft. Now I'm putting this out in the brainstorming, but I just wonder if tinkering around with the commons is actually a way of avoiding that big question.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. Can you just spell that out a little bit more? What would a law on intergenerational theft look like?
You know, what you're highlighting is striking there is the regulation. Now, I don't know what a law of intergenerational equity would look like. It's difficult to craft. But for example, if we take the Climate Change Act here in 2008, Section 1, makes clear we have a duty to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. If we take the Victorian Climate Change Act in 2017, that's zero emissions. Now, you could start playing around with those types of obligations, and they send very clear messages to the markets. But I could see you could get a lot of angst around commons. So.
Okay, so I think this is very interesting, but I wonder if we're talking about two different things, because obviously we need a framework of law, whatever economic sector we happen to be in. And the Climate Change Act is a very good example, and it's got these great intergenerational qualities. Unfortunately, we now know it doesn't go nearly far enough, but we can put that aside. I mean, the principle of it was very sound. And it came about as a result of some fantastic campaigning, which came about as a result of some fantastic thinking. It's discussions just like this one. And what it says is that within a capitalist system, we are going to set up some laws so that capitalist system doesn't completely deprive other people in future generations of the means of living. Now, you could say, well, there's problems with this because the capitalist system means you're necessarily going to start hitting the limits of efficiency within that time period. It's going to be constantly pushing at any limits you aren't already hitting because of the need for growth and because of the way that innovation cuts both ways, but that doesn't invalidate the legal principle of what you're trying to do there. Now, in a commons, you have exactly the same legal principle because the commons is inalienable. So it's sort of baked in, the legal principle is baked in that because you can't sell this, you can't give it away, you can't liquidate those resources, you are almost inherently obliged to pass them on in the same form to the new commoners who come into the system, who might, include people 50 years hence, 100 years hence, and the rest of it. Now, sometimes this is applied more effectively than at other times. If you look at some of the sheep commons in Cumbria, they're total ecological disaster areas. And part of the problem there is a problem of split incentives, is that land is owned by one person, and then there's common rights in it which are held by other people. But partly the whole system has kind of gone wrong and the rules aren't strong enough. So, even within commons, you have to have the right set of rules and the strong enough rules and proper monitoring and enforcement of those rules. And there's always a big question in any commons is the community capable of doing that entirely themselves? Or does there have to be some form of external monitoring and arbitration? Now, what we tend to find is where the community has a completely free hand, it's pretty good at doing it within the limits of its own understanding. But the limits of its understanding might be pretty constrained, as they are in the sheep commons, where you say, oh, isn't this beautiful? Look, it's all green. Yeah, there's nothing else living here except for bloody sheep, but it's green, it's great, that's what we want. And so, obviously, there has to be some sort of external input, if only in the form of better ecological understanding of what's going on. But I would say that what you're suggesting applies equally to any economic system that you might be dealing with, whether it's state ownership, market ownership, household, or commons. You still have to have that intergenerational legal framework at work. And sometimes it's strong enough and sometimes it's not.
Yes.
I'm going to be a bit more radical. I think...
I love this. Everyone's telling me to be more radical. This is brilliant. Come on.
Is the problem. 2 or 3 things occurred to me while you're talking. I think The Guardian reported that 10% of the nation's land passed from public into private ownership in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
That's shocking. The other thing is we had commons. We had these 3-field system and so on. It was the enclosures around in this area around about 1800 that drove them all into private hands. And a little detail there, which I enjoyed, the inalienability of this common land was overruled by Act of Parliament. That's why
That's right.
The enclosures were all driven by Acts of Parliament. My family is all medical, and at a family gathering recently, I said that the real problem, you're all talking about the wrong thing. It's not CO2, it's humans. There are far too many of us. And my brother-in-law said, what are you suggesting? I said, well, let's get rid of the doctors. And he said...
well, that's certainly radical. Does what it says on the tin. Okay, well, so let's apply that that starting position of yours to the 2 examples that you propose, the historical acts of enclosure.
If I may, his first question at the front here was saying, I thought he was saying something quite interesting. Can you use the forces that caused the problem to cure the problem? And I think unless you do that, you won't cure it. The forces are the political forces that drove the enclosures. We haven't solved the problem. It's greed and self-preservation.
Okay.
Now, if you can find those and see how they solve the problem, you'll get there.
Right. Well, let's take your initial premise that the underlying problem is population growth. I take it you mean, and the size of the global population. And you connect this both to the enclosures in the 18th century through Acts of Parliament and through the informal enclosures taking place today with the privatization of state-owned land, as what is Christopher Bartels, is it, who just brought out a book on this subject. I haven't read it yet, but it looks very interesting. I can't see any connection between those issues at all. I mean, what we saw in the 18th century was a tiny proportion of the population, the lords of the land, kicking everybody else off the land and forcing them either into destitution or into the cities. And now what we see is a tiny proportion of the population pouring money into the Conservative Party, which then sells off the land, which they can then profit from. So nothing to do with the general size of the global population or indeed of its growth rate. And this is what we find in issue after issue. That, for instance, today I was writing about how we need to get rid of the private car pretty well. I'm talking about a 90% reduction in private car use within 10 years, one of my many conservative ideas. And several people in the comment thread, which, I got this sort of sick fascination with the comment thread. You should never read a comment thread, but I can't help it. Every time it's sort of drawn in. What do they think? Several people say, the problem is population. Sorry, how is the problem population? In densely habited parts of the country, like Oxford, you can solve this much more easily than you can in lightly habited parts of the country because you've got enough population to sustain a mass transit system. You might ask, why aren't we using one in Oxford? Why haven't we got one yet? Why don't we have electrified light rail or something like that in Oxford? That's another question. But you can do it here because there's enough people. You can't do it out in the small villages because there's not enough footfall to sustain a system like that. And so people are much more dependent on cars. And what we find again and again is that people, you come up with almost any environmental issue and people say, the real problem is population. And you explore this and you say, well, how is the real problem population? And, well, it's just it is, there's too many people. And very often, as with this case, you find that the linkage is either extremely weak or non-existent. And I see us as a whole using population as a way of not engaging with our very real impacts. Because what we're doing, unconsciously I'm sure, is transferring blame away from ourselves, who, as phenomenally rich people by the global standards, have a far greater ecological footprint than most of the world's people, but lower reproductive rates on the whole. We transfer blame for environmental destruction from ourselves onto people with higher reproductive rates, but much, much lower environmental footprints. In fact, what we find, by and large, is that those with the highest number of children are those with the smallest environmental footprints. In fact, a very interesting study by David Satterthwaite and others in India showed that the poorest tenth of the population there, who were generally those who had the largest number of children, had negative environmental footprints because they were, by and large, rubbish collectors who were recycling discarded material back into the economy and therefore effectively working in the environmentally negative part of the economy. And this is just a way of shifting guilt, shifting blame. I don't blame people for doing this because it's kind of human nature. We don't want to recognize our own impacts. But it's incredibly convenient, not least because there's almost nothing you can do about it. Which is another wonderful thing because it deprives us of agency. Oh, it's terrible, it's population. What are you going to do about it? Well, apart from killing all the doctors, which is one way forward, there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do about it. Oh, well, there is one thing, actually, because there are two components. There's birth rate and there's longevity. Any volunteers? Form an orderly queue afterwards. Oh, you put your hand up. Thank you. Very good. That's very good of you, madam.
You could have the next question for volunteer.
I work in public health and I interact with economists around the concept of human well-being. We might spend a lot of time debating what exactly that is, but it's probably a reasonably, a metric we could probably most of us sign up to as a thing. Now, the economists have pretty much shown that it's unrelated to gross domestic product or economic growth. They've also shown that it's above a really quite a low level. It's unrelated to productivity or to consumption or to any of these things that are a real problem in terms of our relationship with the environment. And we know that it is positively supported by interaction with the natural environment, by the quality of relationships between human beings, and indeed in the nature of the distribution of resources and how equal that is. I don't see much of that argument being introduced into this area, because once you start really rubbishing the idea that economic growth is good for any of us, you do start changing the nature of the argument round a bit.
Well, we have to start from physical reality. That's where, everyone is always telling us, oh, it's not politically realistic. It's not economically realistic. You can't do this because it won't fly. And this is what, the young people on the climate strikes are constantly being told at the moment. And Extinction Rebellion people are constantly being told it's not realistic. And they say, okay, well, which realism are you setting as your baseline here? Political realism? Yeah, okay, there is such a thing as political realism, but it can shift. What's politically realistic today could be might have been completely unrealistic 10 years ago. What seems completely unrealistic today might be realistic in 10 years. You never know. Things can shift very quickly indeed, especially in these volatile and vociferous times. Who would have guessed that Donald Trump would be president of the United States? Who would have guessed that Jeremy Corbyn would be leader of the Labour Party? Both of those propositions would have been dismissed as completely unrealistic, politically unrealistic, even 5 years ago. let alone 10. But physical reality, you can't bargain with that at all. The laws of thermodynamics don't change because you want them to. You can't suddenly decide that, oh, the atmosphere can take a bit more carbon and it'll be all right. Because it's not bargaining. It's not in the room doing a deal with you. It's not subject to political persuasion and debate and discussion. And what's the conclusion from that? The conclusion from that is that the physical realities have to become our political and economic baselines. That's what we have to work to and work from at all times. Now we can say, well, it might not fly with people to attack economic growth. Say, well, maybe at the moment it doesn't. Maybe people don't like the idea of stopping economic growth and moving to a different economic system. Well, of course they don't. We're all rather conservative, as I keep being reminded, and we tend to be afraid of change. But we can't persuade the atmosphere that it's okay to carry on with economic growth, because it's just going to spit that out straight back at us. We can't persuade the material world that it's okay to carry on with economic growth, because it's going to spit us out with extreme prejudice. And we're already beginning to see what that means. So our task, I think, is this huge task, almost bigger than any generation has ever had to face. It's sort of almost a resetting of the moral compass. What we thought was morally good turns out to have huge implications that we weren't at all aware of. What we thought was philosophically sound turns out to have missed a crucial part of the picture. And so we almost have to start again, and we have to then bring other people along with us. That's the huge task. And that's where we have to change the political realities.
Man in the middle.
Thanks for the talk. Given the current climatic crisis, and so the situation is deteriorating quite quickly, why do you think politicians are not listening to us and experts like yourself and sort of doing more to combat climate change? It doesn't seem to be, there can't really be a lack of information available, and it doesn't seem to be a lack of activism. And what do you think we can do better or differently to sort of make them listen to us more?
Yeah. Well, it's a crucial question, the crucial political question, I suppose. And the fact is that we are not equally represented in politics. Politicians listen to those with the loudest voices. And those with the loudest voices tend not to be the people who are suffering from the impacts of environmental destruction because they can buy their way out. The great majority of the media is owned by billionaires. You have to be a billionaire to own it. And what billionaires want is radically different to what the climate strikers want. They want to carry on with things as they are. They want to carry on owning their fossil fuel reserves and flying in their private jets and gathering into their own pockets as much natural wealth as they possibly can. They want the opposite to what most people want. And they're the ones whose voices get heard. I mean, I'm working with the Labour Party at the moment on writing a report on the political economy of land. And even Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is bloody terrified of the Daily Mail. Ooh, we might not be able to say this because the Mail wouldn't like it. Shouldn't perhaps be saying this. But, it's like, for God's sake, why does Lord Rothermere, this blinking tax exile, have such a hold over our minds? Why have we allowed Rupert Murdoch to tell us what is and isn't permissible? Why do the weirdo Barclay brothers, why are they enabled to set the political limits of action? It's preposterous, but that's currently how it is. That's the current political reality which we have to change. And we have to change it by far more effective mobilization. I mean, the rich will always be with us. And the rich, the powerful people will always be with us, whatever system we have, and they will try to hijack the system. And we always have to fight back and put them back in their box. And even if we started with the position of total equality, some psychopathic people would try to grab more and elbow other people out of the way, and we had to put them back in their box. And at the moment, we are by and large a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. And it shouldn't carry on that way. Now, obviously, there's a huge range of political techniques we need to address that. Julia.
Thanks so much for being here. Two things on intergenerational theft. The first is a plea, an invitation for everyone to please actually come to the youth strike on March 15th. Last month, when the first strike happened in Oxford, George, you told the crowd, and you have no idea how much it meant to the young students. I was coordinating with them, and they told me after. You said it was the most inspiring climate action you'd ever been to, and so if that's motivation for everyone.
No, the most inspiring action I've ever been to.
Great.
Not just climate action, full stop action.
Yeah, there were over 1,000 people there, and as sort of the Oxford Uni person helping the school students, I can say that there were probably max 25 members of the university there, and that's not acceptable if people to show up for it on March 15th, 11 to 2, Bond Square near Westgate. Anyway, the second part is an actual question, and I'm thinking about sort of the university as an intergenerational institution, a sort of microcosm in a way, and I'm wondering how you think that universities have a responsibility to ensure that they are not perpetuating intergenerational theft. I'm thinking about in the way they teach, how they teach, potentially what they invest in. There's a
Thank you. No, thanks. And just to say about the youth climate strike, I mean, I cried. It was so inspiring and beautiful. It was just extraordinary. In fact, everyone was crying. It was quite remarkable. You know, I've got hardened neighbours who turned up because their children were on it, and they were tears streaming down their face. Quite an astonishing thing to see. And thank you. That's just amazing. Broadly speaking, Oxford University is a real estate conglomerate with some learning attached. These are extremely ruthless institutions. You know, as anyone who's lived in the city outside the university is aware, you know, they just crush any good thing and impose all sorts of bad things. And there's horrendous exploitation involved. We've seen how many universities have resisted divestment campaigns, which are urgently needed. You know, still investing in fossil fuels, all sorts of other redundant economies, and keeping them running. And we've also seen how I feel again and again universities fail their students by teaching them stuff which, you know, isn't actually current. I and others protested during my degree, which admittedly was sort of during the Jurassic, that there wasn't, we were talking about the living world all the time, that we didn't have a single environmental lecture scheduled. So eventually, after repeated protests, one of the ecology lecturers tried to give us an environmental lecture where he said, I mean, he knew nothing about it. It was quite extraordinary. He said, the problem in the Amazon, look, these peasants all moving into it, I would machine gun them. We were just like, what? What are you talking about? And gradually I saw how, you know, when the pressure built up, the Environmental Change Institute was established, which was fantastic. But to begin with, all the lecturers they used came from the other academic disciplines and just were basically downloading their PhD thesis. And I thought, this isn't good enough. Isn't in any way good enough. And still, I feel, with a few glowing exceptions, we're not getting the systemic overview which is necessary. And boy, if it's bad there, what about in economics? What about in the Saïd Business School? It's just appalling, shocking dereliction of duty. Economics departments across the country are teaching their students bollocks, filling their heads with this neoliberal, neoclassical nonsense which bears almost no relation at all to how the real world works. Kate Rayworth's critique of this is highly effective, and also that of the economic students who are trying to reform economics teaching. But again and again, I find in one subject after another that the students are being let down by those who are charged with teaching them about how the world works. And I think we need some radical reforms to the curriculums.
We've probably got time for two. Can we make the next two questions quick ones, and maybe we'll take them together because we should be stopping. And are you prepared to bend your rule because we have two women?
Okay.
Right. Okay. There and there. Yeah.
I'll try to be fast. So I'm on the course, a master's course called Nature, Society, and Environmental Governance. And effectively it's an interdisciplinary approach to environmental issues and kind of climate change. So I think that's kind of a really good start because we're basically critiquing different disciplines. So I'd like to advocate that to undergrads. And then that kind of leads into rewilding, which we touched on earlier. So I'm kind of thinking about the concept of the commons that you've been trying to flesh out. And I was kind of thinking about how you think rewilding fits into this idea in light of things or examples like Nep Estate, where it's a form of rewilding, but it's also, and so it's kind of handing over to the commons, but it's still like a form of the privatisation of nature. And also arguments for rewilding that kind of revolve around tourism as a form of economic benefit. And then therefore that kind of leads into what I think has been exemplified by a lot of questions, is that there's like this change in mindset, which perhaps I did an undergrad in human geography, and I feel like it's been extended into this course. It is this kind of understanding, like example of the question about nature and society and this binary that needs to be really thought about, and that links into,
It's becoming a very long question. Can you shorten it to a very short point? Because
I think that we can change people's mindsets to kind of better understand this relationship between nature and society.
Okay, hold that thought, and then the final question. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm also fortunate to be in the School of Geography, and we had Kate Rayworth as our lecturer. And it really revolutionised the way that I sort of saw economics, which I think was a really cool way. That's something that should definitely be introduced. My question is about resource flows and how the commons concept kind of fits into that in our globalized world, where you mentioned reducing consumption, and the consumption in richer areas often relies on the extraction of natural wealth in poorer places, and how that sort of fits into this concept of the commons globally, nationally, subnationally, and
thank you. Well, neither of them are easy questions to answer. No, they're both very good ones. But it's true that in countries like our own, our wealth, including much of the wealth of the university, is built on the colonial extraction of other people's wealth. And we're only just beginning to grasp the extent to which this is the case, that basically, the Industrial Revolution in England was based on the stolen wealth from elsewhere. And sure, there was massive exploitation within England as well, but it kicked off the more general sharing of wealth that some people at least enjoy today, but that is based on theft. It is fundamentally based on theft. So we've got intergenerational theft, we've got interspecific theft, and we've got international theft as well, all taking place at the same time, which somewhat complicates the question even further. There isn't any easy answer, obviously, to any of these things, but I think they have to be considered as a whole. We have to recognize that they are interconnected, just as the other issues are that we're discussing. And so often we see emancipation in one part of the rich world turns out to be dependent on the continued enslavement of people in a part of the poor world. Again and again, we see this happening. We sort of see the resurgent working class in 19th century England, and we say, fantastic, people gained rights, and part of the reason they were able to do so was on the back of an industrialization which depended entirely on the exploitation and enslavement of millions of people around the world. And that's not in any way to diss those rights and the necessity to gain those rights, but it's to recognize that there was a payoff, and it was a devastating payoff. And if you would force me to say was it worth it? I would find it really hard to answer that question. Just as I find it really hard to answer the question about the payoffs that we have today. On your question about the relationship between humans and nature, I mean, that's a very broad question, but I'll try to sort of stick with the sort of narrower formulation about the sort of aristocratic rewilding you discuss. And I think it's absolutely essential, actually, that rewilding is not just another tool for securing natural wealth. I much prefer the model, for instance, that Trees for Life has in Scotland, which is a sort of people's rewilding, where they bought land through public subscription, and they are then rewilding that land through public action, through mass volunteer tree planting and other stuff, which apparently I'm told is a lovely thing to do. Everyone who goes there goes again because they really enjoy that. And there's that sort of sense that we do this as a shared project, I think, is essential. I don't think there's any justification for saying, I'm going to transform the nature of this land by myself as a major landowner. This is something that, like all the best things in life, we should do together.
On that note, please put your hands together.